Welcome to the Legally Ever After Real Estate Podcast, where we help you build, protect, and pass on your assets. I'm your host, estate planning attorney, Pamela Moss-Garrett. Let's get started. Today we have Byron Elliott. He is an attorney from Three Pillars Law, and we are going to be talking about best practices for syndication. Welcome, Byron.
Hi, Pam. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for being here. So let's dig in. I know kind of when it comes to syndication and private equity raising, there's kind of a typical life cycle of an investor that you wanted to kind of touch base about first. Can you share that with us?
Yeah, I'd like to kind of share what that progression looks like, and then kind of where we as a firm, where we fit in. I guess a little bit of background. So we're in a small boutique firm just south of Denver in Castle Rock. About 90% of the work we do is helping real estate investors and developers raise private equity legally and ethically. So we spend quite a bit of time doing that. And so, a typical real estate journey, you may have somebody who wants to dip their toe in the water, have an investment property because they understand the economic benefits of real estate as an investment platform. They may want to have a vacation home, but also be able to rent it out and make some additional income. You may have somebody who has an ADU, an alternative dwelling unit. And so that's, I set it up as either a mother-in-law suite or they rent it out to a third party. But a lot of times the clients that we work with have started out doing that, maybe purchased a short-term rental or two along the way. But ultimately, at some point, because most lenders want some sort of, 4-6 months of reserves on any additional investment properties, a lot of times the people's individual balance sheets will culminate. And so they can't find lending on additional investment properties. So from there, it's pretty common that people will team up with a partner or a joint venture in a deal. And so that's just somebody who maybe brings some cash to the table, but is also actively participating in the deal. So for me, for example, my best friend from high school, Dave, he and I have done 4 joint venture agreements where he brings his balance sheet, his borrowing power. I find the property, craft the deal collectively between him and my wife, Katie. We work on the properties together, but because we're all actively participating, that would be characterized as a joint venture agreement. And so parties that are all actively participating in the deal in one way or another. But then it's the same thing at some point, even between the two of us, our balance sheet may culminate, but we want to continue to invest in real estate, buy bigger projects with more opportunities, right? Mm-hmm. And so this is where syndication comes in. So there's not really a legal term for syndication. It's applying the same ability to raise private equity through an exemption under the Securities Act of 1933. And so what that allows for is if you want to go out and raise private equity from other people who will not actively participate in your deal, there are certain ways that you have to craft that deal and certain obligations you have as what's called the sponsor to make sure that your behavior and your offering documents comport with the Securities Act of 1933 and what we call a Reg D exemption that lets you raise that money without filing as if you're a stock, bond, or mutual fund.
That's super helpful. And I think what I'm understanding is where that delineation is, Byron, is, if you're actively working with family members and friends and people and coming together to do a deal, that's one thing. But then once you start getting people involved who are going to be passive, there's a lot of tricky gray area where you really need to comply with the laws. That's kind of that line of where people need to be thinking about. Okay.
Yeah, you have to examine the activity level of the investors and whether that's passive or not. So
is it active and passive is one criteria? Is the number of investors or the size of the deal any factor in kind of how the SEC and the government looks at and the regulations?
Yeah, so good. We just had this internal discussion with our staff this morning. And so the definition of a security is pretty broad, but at the end of the day, if you're going to evaluate an investment to determine if it's a security, you're basically going to look at this level of participation. And so one thing that falls outside of the SEC's definition of a security is an actual ownership interest in a piece of real estate. And so compare that with like a mutual fund or a stock or a bond. Those are all very clearly securities. Most promissory notes would be characterized as a security, but an ownership interest in a piece of real estate or an ownership interest in a company that's purchasing that piece of real estate is outside of that definition. And so when I'm working with clients, one, we take a look at how are they raising money? And so how they're raising money and what type of investor that they're using. Is it an accredited investor? Is it a non-accredited investor? And we can get into that definition in a minute here. Are you selling a security to raise capital to invest in something? And then what's a very important thing to understand is whether that money that's been raised through the sale of a security is, again, being invested in a piece of real estate or invested in another security. When you're investing in another security now, you are getting into the realm of what we call the 40s Acts. So that's the Investment Company Act of 1940 and the Investment Advisor Act of 1940. And so when you talk about the number of investors and what limitations you have, that really comes into play when you're selling a security and then purchasing another security with that capital. And so if you're going to do that, then we have to navigate first the Investment Company Act. And so you have to find an exemption to operate as an investment company. So the most common ones there are what's called a 3C1 exemption, which limits you to 99 beneficial owners. So that's where we get to answer that question about the number of owners and whether that's important or not.
Okay.
And then the other exemption is a 3C7. And those both have, kind of some constraints at the end of the day. But that's really when we're concerned about the number of investors or beneficial owners.
And then when we talk about kind of being active versus and how much activity there needs to be, if I'm putting together a deal with a few family members and some of my family members, really don't have the level of expertise. They don't really they just trust me because they're a family member and they want to be involved. But they're not savvy. They don't really know what to do. How active do they really need to be with it to kind of fall under the requirements that you're mentioning?
Yeah. So, every deal I always look, because I have a lot of clients who come together and they want to co-sponsor a deal. And so it's the same thing. Each of them has the ability to raise some capital. They have a network, they have an investor database, but ideally each of them brings something additional to the table beyond just raising capital. And we'll get into the do's and don'ts and we'll address that topic in a minute here. But just if you take a look at what are the typical activities that have to take place, right? In the context of any business organization, but let's say a real estate deal specifically is, you typically have like a CEO type. So somebody who high level is managing all of the other activities, making sure they're getting done. You usually have a money guy. So that's a CFO or comptroller, whatever you want to call it. You usually have a marketing person. In this space, you usually have investor relations. So somebody who's managing the investor database and communicating with investors and whatever else. And then you may have an operations person, right? So those are kind of, if I were to write a duty description for each of those 5 positions, and you just pull out some activities of each and you assign those to people that are participating in the group. The other thing we're looking to is the level of control that these investors may have. And so in a kind of straightforward syndication, we write the offering documents in a way where the investors have little to no control over the company, other than if they need to remove a manager or the sponsor for an event of cause. And at the end of the day, that's given almost complete discretion to the sponsor to run and execute the business plan as they see fit, because they found the deal, they found the opportunity. Ideally, they've got the experience to execute the business plan. Maybe they've got a good track record, a really good comprehensive team, but you don't want to socialize every single decision that needs to be made at the company level with all of the investors. That's just not the way these things work. Going back to your example about if you were to cobble together a group of people, friends and family, the other activities that have to take place is you have to prepare tax returns. Kind of think of like a board structure. You have to have maybe a secretary who calls meetings and keeps meeting minutes and, adheres to corporate compliance requirements, right? You do have investor relations. You have all of these activities. And so what you can do, even if somebody isn't experienced in that particular thing, a lot of people have a background in something that can add value to that team, and therefore they're actively participating.
And then just to kind of say it in a simple way, if you don't comply with this, what happens? What's the bad things that can happen?
Yeah. So, I mean, when it really comes into play is when an investor feels that they've been grieved in some way, right? So, if unfortunately the deal loses money, the investor may file some sort of investigative effort with either the state, the state securities body, or even the SEC, and an investigation may ensue. There are some stiff consequences for people that are found to be selling securities and not comporting with the securities laws. In some cases, they may unwind the deal. And so, somebody would have to take a look at the deal and the structure of the company, the purchase of the asset, and whatever else, and may unwind the deal entirely. So it's certainly important to, when you're taking anything that even resembles passive money from an investor, to at least have a discussion with an attorney.
That's super helpful. All right, great. So you were going to kind of shift into talking about some do's and don'ts when it comes to kind of the structures we're discussing right now.
Yeah. So, and we talked a little bit about a couple of those, but let's talk about the types of what we call offerings, right? So these Reg D exemptions. The most popular one for people that are just getting into syndicated deals is what's called a 506B. So it's just Rule 506B of Reg D. And that allows you to deal with both accredited and non-accredited investors. And so just high-level accredited investors are people who have a net worth of $1 million or more, excluding the equity in their private residence. Or they can qualify based on compensation. So if you're single and you've made $200,000 per year in annual income the last 2 years with a reasonable expectation of doing so in the year to come, or if you're married, it's $300,000 as a family, then you're an accredited investor. Non-accredited investors can participate in 506B offerings, but the sponsor has to reasonably ascertain that the investor has enough sophistication to understand the nature of the deal, right? And so that's not really neat and clean. You may think that that's just based on a person's education, or maybe it's based on their experience, but it's a factor by factor analysis. So let me give you an example there. You may have, let's say, a medical doctor who's obviously highly educated, but has never invested, whether it's stock, bond, mutual fund, never invested in real estate. You're going to provide them offering documents, and they're going to read documents, but these offering documents are pretty comprehensive. They're not easy to digest if you haven't invested before. And so you, as the sponsor, you'd have to determine, does that doctor have the level of sophistication? And that presumes he's a non-accredited investor. So if he's an accredited investor, less an issue.
For becoming an accredited investor, is there somewhere that's submitted? Is it an actual accreditation? And if so, who is it through?
Great, good question. So in a 506B offering, this is the other reason they're very popular, is the investor does their own self-accreditation. And so we pull together an offering documents package, and one of the documents in that package is simply a questionnaire that asks that threshold question: are you an accredited investor? Yes or no. Here's the definition. If no, well, then we go through and ask a series of questions that help us determine their level of sophistication. So that may be, what is the highest level of education you achieved? What is your experience in investing generally? What's your experience in investing in real estate? What is your investment criteria? What asset classes do you like? And by asset classes, I'm talking about, do you like mobile home parks? Do you like multifamily apartments? Do you like short-term rentals? Do you like self-storage, right? Goes on and on. But what you're doing by asking these questions is you tease out an understanding of how sophisticated this investor is and whether they're a good match for your particular offering. So I want to add one practical tip for this real quick before we get into the rest of the 506B stuff. But one of the things that I do is we have a form-based questionnaire on Microsoft Forms. And I think you can use Google Forms, any Forms platform, form site. And I build out this questionnaire, and then we send it to prospective investors. That way, not only are they filling in the information, they're doing their self-certification, but I've got a date time stamp of when they filled it out, when they've submitted it or signed it. But it also exports to an Excel document. And so if I have multiple offerings going on, For example, something comes across my desk, not as an attorney, but as a real estate investor, like a mobile home park. Well, then I can sort my investor database on who selected mobile home parks as one of their asset classes that they really like. So it also, imagine it's a lack of data entry requirement on your part as the sponsor if they're actually going in and filling out the form. So it saves you a lot of time. So on the 506B side of the house, some of the constraints is you have to have a pre-existing relationship, a pre-existing substantive relationship with the investor before you make an offer. And so that also isn't a neat and clean definition. So I typically give people two examples. You and I could have a phone call, right now, and let's say we didn't have any contact for the next 6 months. Our phone call is very superficial, high level introductory stuff, lasts 5 minutes. Probably doesn't give us the opportunity for me to evaluate your level of sophistication or your investment objectives and whatnot. Doesn't allow for you to ask me the kind of questions you would want to know about me as a prospective sponsor. 6 months goes by, I have a deal. I would say I would be cautious about presenting that deal to you, because even though we have this pre-existing relationship, it wasn't substantive. So you hear some people in the industry, they'll talk about some sort of cooling off period, 3 months, 6 months, whatever it may be. But I would challenge that at the same time, I could meet somebody at a real estate investment conference on Thursday afternoon. We have dinner on Thursday afternoon. We have breakfast on Friday. We've spent an entire day at a conference together. We've compared portfolios. We've had lengthy discussions. They've filled out their questionnaire. I've only known this person for 4 days, but after that kind of interaction, I would feel very comfortable on Monday sending them an offering, because we've had that chance to dialogue back and forth. And so this is something that's very important in terms of do's and don'ts with the 506B offering, is make sure that you have that pre-existing substantive relationship with the investor. The other limitation is you can't openly solicit. And so you've probably seen on Facebook or LinkedIn, or you probably get email message if you've ever downloaded somebody's ebook, all of these different offerings that come across, right? And usually those are not they shouldn't be 506B offerings. They should be 506C offerings. And so at the end of the day, that's one of the limitations. And that's why 506B is popular with the friends and family around, because you probably already have that relationship with them. They do the self-certification, but you know them well enough to determine if they have the level of sophistication, so you can't openly solicit. The other type of offering is a 506C offering. And so for a 506C offering, it's accredited investors only. You openly solicit, but it requires a third-party investor verification.
Okay.
Yep. And so that investor has to, either send some financial information, tax returns, a personal financial statement, bank account balances, or something to either an attorney, a CPA, financial advisor type. And that third party will certify that that person is accredited. That certification letter then goes back to the sponsor to keep on file. But you can openly solicit. That's why people love it. And in terms of just a progression on the syndication side of the house, that's where people who do multiple deals, at some point they graduate into these 506C offerings, because they're concurrently building their investor database at the same time that they're doing their first one or two offerings. So it's pretty common.
So is the big difference for 506C is that third-party certification that there's an accredited investor and you can solicit? Is there any other requirements or mistakes people make with those types of deals? That's about what it is, but I can give you kind of some high level do's and don'ts that pertain to both types of offerings, right? Great. The first one is, when you're going to do one of these exempt offerings, it's very common to do a private placement memorandum. Mm-hmm. So people are, PPM, you've probably heard this before, and that PPM is very similar to a prospectus you get from a stock, bond, or mutual fund that has all of these mandatory disclosures. On kind of high level, what you're looking for is, what is the company history? What are the terms of the offering? So if you're putting a 50K investment in, what is your expectation for a return? Granted, it's not a guaranteed return, it's a pro forma return. You learn about who are the principals and the sponsoring entities, so whether that's an LLC or limited partnership or whatever it may be.
You look at what's called the sources and uses. So it's basically like a budget. So your sources are your capital stack. So I'm going to give you an example, $5 million project. Let's say that you're going to borrow $4 million from the bank and you're going to raise $1 million in private equity. And so that's your capital stack. That's your sources. On the uses side of the house, you're going to get into, okay, I'm going to acquire the land for $350,000 or $3.5 million, right? I'm going to have some pre-development soft costs, depending on the type of deal that I'm doing. I want an operating reserve, whatever else it may be. And then it's customary that the sponsor would earn certain fees for pulling the deal together, taking the risk, doing the due diligence, paying the fees up front for legal work and geotech inspections and surveys and all of the stuff that goes along with a typical offering. And so at the end of the day, those two numbers should balance out the sources and uses. So you want to make sure you go to a certain level of detail, and you want to make sure that when you're allocating those monies that you've raised and borrowed, that you're following to some degree that uses table and not going off the reservation and doing whatever you want with that money.
Okay.
A big part of a PPM is risk factors. And so there are some high level risk factors that would be disclosed to the prospective investor based on just what's going on in the world. So we typically start very high level. So, I mean, if you think back, what's going on high level in the world right now that could potentially affect investing, it can affect supply chains, it can affect interest rates. So, I mean, the war in Ukraine, right? COVID, the results of the presidential election, the inflation right now, the rising interest rates. These are all things that should be captured and disclosed to investors high level about what may affect this particular deal. Then you go a little bit more granular down to, okay, this particular asset class or this particular region. So for example, if you have let's say an RV park that's located in Texas, and that RV park is not necessarily a destination, it's set up in close proximity to the oil and gas industry. Well, that fluctuates, right? That fluctuates based on what's going on in the world, what's going on with the law. And so you would want to disclose to investors, hey, look, this is highly dependent upon the oil and gas industry. So make your decision accordingly. And then you get down into the actual individual property level. So there may be, something based on a certain asset class, or, those are the kind of things that we kind of tease out. And we work with a sponsor on that because a lot of times they're experts on their particular asset class. We take what they give to us in terms of risks. We do a little wordsmithing. We incorporate it into the PPM because that's an obligation is to disclose these risk factors.
And is the risk that if you don't disclose the risks well enough, that there could be a complaint down the road if things go south? And what is the risks? Is it litigation? Is it being audited? Is it the SEC coming after you? Is it criminal? Kind of what are the risks that these sponsors need to be aware of?
Yeah, so what you're looking to avoid is any material misrepresentation or omission. And so at the end of the day, you're not going to capture every risk factor under the sun, right? You can't account for the war in Ukraine. You can't account for supply chain shortages. You have to give it your best effort, right? Even the interest rates and this inflation, like, I don't know, not a lot of financial analysts that I saw, until things started actually escalating in terms of inflation and interest rates, not a lot of people were ahead of the curve there, in my opinion. So can you capture all of that? I don't know. I would say no. But if you aren't disclosing something and you aren't communicating with investors, that's where you get in trouble. And so it really depends on a lack of communication. And again, this misrepresentation or omission. You're subject to investigation, of course. If it's found that you're misrepresenting or you're fraudulent in your behavior, of course, there's opportunity for criminal activity. And in some cases, these sponsors, if they can be characterized as a bad actor, found to be a bad actor, then for 10 years they can't participate in these kind of deals. And so your career aspirations, if that's your goal, is to be a sponsor and invest in real estate deals, pull together deals, the consequences are pretty harsh.
Yeah. And so, I think obviously I come from the law enforcement background, so I'm always wary of kind of who's out there and what people are doing. And I've seen a lot of bad stuff. I also grew up in Arizona, and I feel like that's an area where there's a lot of vulnerable individuals. It's a lot of retirees that have lots of money, and there are people coming and pitching to them. And, when things go south, those people aren't in the best position to challenge it. And I think really the people that come to you that work with your firm are trying to do it legally and ethically, right? Because they're working with legal counsel. But I think it's important. It's not a willful standard, right? So there can be people that just don't know what they don't know, and they can still be held responsible because they haven't taken the extra step of working with a professional like you to do all the right things to really protect themselves and then do the right things so that they can be in this field for a long time. So that's super helpful to know.
Yeah, and that's good. You just touched on a don't, or I guess a do, depending on how you look at it. From a passive investor perspective is, I think the number one thing you want to take a look at is who is the sponsor of the deal. So if it's somebody that doesn't have a real estate background, if it's somebody that doesn't have a finance background or a business background, and they're simply putting together the deal because they have a good network of potential investors, I would be wary of that. So I would do some due diligence on the sponsors, and the things that I'm looking at it is everything I just described. Now, that's not to say people haven't pivoted from another career where they've been successful into real estate. That's actually really, really common. What you're seeing a lot right now is high W-2 income earning professionals that are tired of paying 39% taxes on every dollar they earn are looking to find a way to generate some generational wealth that has some tax advantages to it. And so, I just, again, look at the acumen of that person. Are they somebody who understands finances and numbers? Like, I have clients who are doctors, I have clients who are dentists, and they're also syndicating deals on the side, and they're very successful at doing it.
That's super helpful.
So going back to the typical life cycle of an investor, a lot of times what you'll see is people will pull together a deal as a sponsor, hopefully go full cycle on a handful of deals and generate enough income from those where they can in turn then become a passive investor. So that's kind of where I'm at on the personal level is, we're grinding out some deals on the personal side so we can generate enough cash and invest in some other sponsor deals and earn that passive income. So it's kind of two ways to get into the syndication space. And one is, if you want to be an active operator, if you feel comfortable dealing with tenants and toilets and termites and everything that goes along with that, evictions, right? If you feel comfortable doing that, there's a lot of opportunity there. But if you don't want to deal with that stuff, but you want to enjoy the benefits of investing in real estate, there are a ton of passive investor opportunities out there that typically provide really good returns and also allow for the allocation of depreciation and losses. And so at the end of the day, the dollar amount that you're getting back is probably 39% more than you would otherwise if you're applying those losses to it. It's a beautiful thing.
For people that are listening who want to get into passive investing in these types of deals, what is kind of a typical range of an investment as far as, and I know it varies, but what's kind of the entry level and what's kind of the amount that's really worth the amount to invest? And then also, where should they be finding these good sponsors? And I know you're part of a lot of different organizations and things like that, but for people looking, besides getting the Instagram or, the cold messages, where should they be really doing their due diligence to find good deals and good sponsors?
Yep. So great question. There are a lot of free resources out there that can help you understand both the structure, but also learn about different sponsors. And so, the way I got into this space is podcasts and a couple of real estate seminars. And then I have a mentor in the space who kind of showed me how they were structuring deals. I did an internship with them as well. It was a wonderful experience. But podcasts are huge, in my opinion, because a lot of them are structured in a way where people will come on and they'll tell their story. And it's amazing because each time, the interviewer is going to ask, what's your story? How did you craft your deal? How did you develop your capital stack? Where do you find your investors? What type of play is this? And so when I say that, what kind of real estate play is it? Is it a ground up development? Is it distressed property? Is it something where you're going to add some value to the property and squeeze out some forced appreciation? Those are the kind of things that you'll learn, the vernacular. And then, there's a ton of good materials out there I've got my staff right now reading The Hands-Off Investor, which is a great book. Gets into it really focuses on the passive investor side of the house, but it's written by a sponsor and an operator, and so it gets into a pretty good level of detail of what to look for when underwriting a sponsor.
Is there any podcast you recommend?
I got started on Joe Fairless's podcast, Best Ever Real Estate Podcast, and it's really fun. From the very beginning, he structured the podcast in a neat way. So it's 7 days a week. I think 3 or 4 days a week are, like I just described, they bring people on, they interview them and whatnot and tell their story. And then he has a skill set Sunday. So he may have a topic that isn't, related specifically to real estate, but it's something that an investor or somebody who's looking to build generational wealth would want to know. So they get into like trusts, right? That kind of stuff. Some of the stuff that you do. And then 1 or 2 other episodes, he may have what's called Syndication School. And so he has his co-hosts run through, here are some of the ways that if you're going to build a deal, here's one component of building a deal. And it gets into providing some analysis and even some downloadable practical exercises that you can use in order to understand how to start to syndicate a deal. So that's really helpful. The other one that I really like is the Real Estate CPA. And these guys are great. I would tell you some of the stuff I've learned from their podcast and then applying it to my own investments have literally saved hundreds of thousands of dollars in taxes.
That's amazing. Yeah.
And that's the big thing about real estate is they're not making more of it, and the tax benefits are just amazing. And so if you really want to go, at the basic level, if you interviewed 100 real estate investors on where they got started, probably 75 would say they read Rich Dad, Poor Dad.
Yeah.
And so that's a wonderful series to get started. That book is very well written in terms of just changing your paradigm on investing and how money works. And then Robert Kiyosaki has a series of other books. And so one of the next books is called Cash Flow Quadrant and talks about how to rotate out of your W-2 job where you're paying 40% of the taxes and, into something that's producing passive income and is most tax advantaged. And then the follow on there is what's called Unfair Advantage. And that is specifically for people that want to learn about those deals that only accredited investors learn about. See, the thing is, most of the time people go to their financial advisor. So regardless of who that is, that financial advisor typically is trying to sell you their products, which is stock, bonds, mutual funds, right? They will never or rarely ever talk about these alternative investments that are probably, giving 2, 3, 4 times the returns with the tax advantages that we were talking about. And so those series of books really kind of put that whole paradigm on its head and really opens your mind to the possibilities of investing in real estate.
That's super helpful. As far as kind of the amount that people need to invest to get in, are we talking, I've seen a few different things where it's like 50,000, 100,000. Have you seen like a typical minimum and kind of ranges?
Yeah. So that's kind of a progression as well, right? I think the first handful of raises, most of our clients are doing a $25,000 minimum. It's very common for a $50,000 minimum. That's probably the most common. As our clients grow and they build their investor database and the investors see the kind of returns and feel comfortable with the track record, and as they escalate into bigger deals, they're looking for investors to provide larger chunks of money. And so some deals are structured in a way to incentivize investors to come in at much larger chunks of money. And so what I mean by that is when you're raising capital in these offerings, you basically pull together an LLC or a limited partnership, and you're selling off membership interest in that company in exchange for a capital contribution in. And then that capital contribution, that is part of your capital stack that's used to purchase and renovate or whatever it may be. And so they may build in 2 types of investment opportunities, where one type is you're coming in at a 25 to 50K minimum. And that's typically what people refer to as a retail investor. So that's Pam or that's Byron, and I'm investing 25K from my own money or from a self-directed IRA or something like that. And that return is going to get, or that investment is going to get you, let's say, a 7% preferred return. which means that before any other money is distributed to the sponsor, that any proceeds from operations or from a sale or distribution, you get to catch up that 7% based on your initial capital contribution year after year. But they may have another class of units where the minimum investment is $1 million. And the people coming in $1 million are going to get a 9.5, 10% preferred return because they are taking more risk. They're putting more capital in. And you can see it incentivizes bigger chunks of money to come in. So less investors that you have to deal with.
That's great. What is the best way for people to reach out to you, Byron? And what specifically does your firm kind of specialize in?
So we're online, threepillarslaw.com. My email address is byron@threepillarslaw.com. You can get on our website. We've got some resource pages for you. We share our fee structure. We're very transparent about that. Email is great because I am on the road quite a bit. And like I said, we're just south of Denver. It's a little boutique firm. I have 4 full-time attorneys, and then I have 5 of-counsel attorneys that help when I have bandwidth issues or they provide some sort of unique specialty. But 90% of our work is doing everything that we just described in this podcast. It's helping. Most of the time, it's newer investors. So it's people that are graduating into the syndication space. And we really like that because we really like to counsel, coach, and mentor, kind of remove the barriers to entry to getting into real estate syndication with the assumption that if that sponsor grows and gets bigger over time, our firm is probably going to help them along the way, especially if we give them the kind of service that we want.
That's super helpful. So my final question for you today is a question that I ask every guest on the show. Byron, what is your legacy? What is the legacy you're building?
Yes, I think there's 2 parts to that. One is our kids, right? And so if we can have kids that are contributing members to society, and they're educated, they're smart with their money. At a minimum, they take care of their own needs. Ideally, they volunteer and take care of other people's needs. That's a win, right? That's a pretty happy, healthy legacy. And the other thing that I'm kind of passionate about right now is using my platform, whether it's through podcasting like this or my own investment activities, is teaching and coaching veterans how to leverage their VA loan to build generational wealth. So a quick example there is a lot of veterans and service members don't know you can use this beautiful loan product, this VA loan product with little to no money down, but you can buy up to a quadplex. And so house hacking is another real estate investment strategy, but it's hard to find a quadplex, triplex, or duplex. People don't make a lot of those anymore. And so what I want to do on the investment side of the house and as a developer is actually roll out opportunities for veterans to use their VA loan and actually build out quadplexes, triplexes, duplexes where they live in one part of the building and they rent the other parts out for additional income, or they're flexible enough for multi-generational living. And so, there's such a challenge right now with attainable or affordable housing, the cost of materials being so expensive, the labor shortage, in the trades and this skilled labor, that things are just getting really, really expensive. And so we're adopting a design by our architect, Jonathan Sims, and then adopting some principles that I saw in Europe where you had maybe even 3 generations living under one roof. Because unfortunately, the cost of building houses now is such that it can get pretty cost prohibitive for homeownership. And so coupling those kind of characteristics together, I think that we're going to do some pretty cool stuff over the next 5 to 10 years.
I love that, Byron, and thank you for your service. And my husband's also a veteran, and we used our VA loan. So love hearing that mission and what you guys are preparing. It's going to make such a huge difference in the world. Well, thank you so much, Byron, for being on.
Yes, that was really fun. I appreciate it. Thanks again for the opportunity.
Absolutely. If you need an updated will, trust, or estate plan, and you are a Colorado resident, we would love to be your estate planning law firm. Give us a call at 720-706-0036 to schedule your complimentary 15-minute call. You can also directly schedule at lawmother.com/go. If you liked this episode and you want to learn more, you should definitely check out my international best-selling book, Legally Ever After. It's available on Amazon as both an ebook, a paperback, and an audio version. And if you'd like a free chapter, head over to lawmother.com/LEA.